Coca-Cola and Pepsi are grappling with a cost catastrophe that has absolutely nothing to do with sweeteners, freight logistics, or workforce wages. The price of aluminum, the very metal that constitutes each and every one of their tens of billions of cans, has skyrocketed by 50% over the course of the past year and a half, and all available indicators suggest that it is not retreating. But here is the critical dimension that virtually all mainstream coverage continues to overlook. This is not simply a byproduct of generalized inflation. This is structural. This is, in many meaningful respects, strategic. Canada dominates more than 90% of North America's so-called green aluminum output, a category of metal manufactured using hydroelectric energy rather than fossil fuels like coal or natural gas. As corporate sustainability pledges collide head-on with the looming implementation of carbon border adjustment taxes, that particular variety of aluminum has transitioned almost overnight from a desirable option to an absolute operational necessity. Canada's geographic and infrastructural advantage has been converted into a genuine choke point in one of the world's most essential industrial supply chains. And while former U.S. President Donald Trump casually tossed out quips about annexing Canada as the 51st state, Canada has been quietly and methodically demonstrating precisely how formidable its actual leverage is. If you want analysis that draws meaningful connections between commodity markets, climate legislation, and shifting geopolitical authority, then this story deserves your full attention, because what is unfolding here extends far beyond a simple price increase. Let us dissect every layer of it. Begin with the sheer magnitude involved. Coca-Cola manufactures upward of 200 billion aluminum cans annually. PepsiCo operates at a comparable volume. Combined, that represents hundreds of billions of individual units produced globally every single year. And across North America specifically, the overwhelming majority of those cans are fabricated from aluminum sourced, either directly or through intermediary channels, from Canadian smelting operations. When the cost of that foundational input material rises by 50%, the consequences are not trivial accounting adjustments. We are discussing billions upon billions of dollars in additional expenditure landing squarely on two of the most globally recognized consumer brands in existence. And the impact is not limited to beverage manufacturers. Apple has publicly pledged to incorporate green aluminum into its product manufacturing processes. Major automotive corporations are actively restructuring their supplier networks in response to the same pricing dynamics. The construction sector is monitoring the same cost trajectories with growing alarm. But Coca-Cola and Pepsi provide the most accessible and universally understood illustration, because everyone understands what these companies make, and everyone can intuitively grasp what a 50% cost increase means when you're operating at that kind of volume. To understand why this crisis is happening, one must first understand a term that most people outside of industrial or environmental policy circles have never encountered: green aluminum. Here is the distinction. Conventional aluminum production ranks among the most energy-intensive industrial manufacturing processes on the planet. The standard procedure involves extracting bauxite ore from the earth, refining it into alumina through a chemical process, and then smelting that alumina into usable aluminum metal using enormous quantities of electricity. For most of the industry's history, that electricity was generated from coal or natural gas, meaning that traditional aluminum smelting carries with it a colossal carbon footprint. Under typical coal-powered conditions, producing a single ton of aluminum generates roughly 12 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. Green aluminum is chemically and physically identical to its conventional counterpart. The sole but crucial difference lies in how the energy powering its production is generated. When a smelter is operated using renewable electricity, almost invariably hydroelectric power, the embedded carbon emissions associated with that aluminum plummet by approximately 70%. The end product is indistinguishable. The environmental pathway to that product is radically different. For decades, this distinction carried little commercial significance. Aluminum was aluminum. If a company wished to pay a modest premium for the reduced carbon variant as part of a public relations or sustainability initiative, that option existed. But it occupied a niche corner of the market, driven by firms seeking to polish their environmental credentials rather than by any hard financial imperative. That dynamic has been fundamentally and permanently overturned in the past several years, for two converging and mutually reinforcing reasons. The first reason is that corporate sustainability commitments evolved from loosely worded aspirational statements into legally binding procurement specifications. When companies like Apple, BMW, and Coca-Cola announced transitions to low-carbon aluminum as components of their net-zero climate strategies, those announcements eventually became enforceable terms embedded in supplier contracts. The ESG language that once existed only in annual reports migrated into purchase orders. The second reason is that carbon border adjustment mechanisms, long discussed in theoretical policy frameworks, began transitioning into actual enforceable legislation. The European Union has been actively rolling out a carbon border tax. The United States is at various stages of considering analogous policies. What this means in concrete operational terms is the following. If your organization imports aluminum that was produced using coal-fired electricity, you will be assessed a tax reflecting the embedded carbon content of that metal. If you source green aluminum instead, you circumvent that tax entirely. In an instant, green aluminum ceased to be merely admirable and became financially indispensable. This is precisely where Canada's position becomes decisive. Canada accounts for over 90% of North America's green aluminum production capacity. It is not a close competition. The explanation lies in a combination of geography, history, and infrastructure investment made generations ago. Quebec in particular possesses some of the most abundant and cost-competitive hydroelectric generating capacity anywhere in the world. The province developed massive hydroelectric dam systems decades before anyone was contemplating carbon markets or sustainability pledges, and aluminum smelters were deliberately constructed adjacent to those power sources, because electricity is the single largest input cost in aluminum production, and proximity to cheap, abundant electricity was simply sound economics. Canadian industrial giants like Rio Tinto and Alcoa established and expanded smelting operations in Quebec over the course of many decades. The engineers and executives who built those facilities were not thinking about ESG scores, carbon accounting, or international climate treaties. They were thinking about operational efficiency and energy costs. But the legacy infrastructure they created has, in the current geopolitical and regulatory environment, become a profound strategic asset. The situation in the United States tells a very different story. Most domestic U.S. aluminum production either shut down in previous decades, unable to compete on cost, or continues to rely on natural gas and coal-based electricity. Very few American facilities can credibly claim low-carbon production at anything approaching industrial scale. So when global corporations suddenly found themselves contractually and financially obligated to source green aluminum, there was exactly one realistic supplier base within North America: Canada. The timing of this price surge did not occur in a vacuum, and it is not accidental. The acceleration began approximately 18 months ago, coinciding almost precisely with the moment when a cascade of corporate climate commitments began converting from public relations announcements into active procurement requirements. Apple unveiled its green aluminum sourcing program. Major beverage companies commenced signing supplier agreements specifying low-carbon origin requirements. Automotive manufacturers operating under mounting pressure from European regulatory frameworks began systematically restructuring their supply chains. All of that demand materialized in the market simultaneously. And the supply side of the equation did not respond, because it could not. You cannot rapidly construct new green aluminum smelting capacity. The process demands years of regulatory approval, environmental assessment, and planning. It requires billions of dollars in capital deployment. And most critically, it requires access to renewable energy infrastructure at industrial scale, a prerequisite that most potential locations simply cannot satisfy. Canada had the operational smelters. Every competing nation had intentions and blueprints. Canadian aluminum producers consequently found themselves in an extraordinarily advantageous commercial position. Demand escalating sharply, supply constrained by structural rather than temporary factors, and meaningful competition essentially non-existent. In a conventional commodity market, rising prices attract new entrants, supply expands, and prices eventually stabilize. But this is no longer a conventional commodity market. The barrier to entry is not simply financial, it is carbon-based. If a new smelter is built and powered by natural gas, the result is expensive high-carbon aluminum that no organization with credible sustainability commitments can purchase. The requirement for renewable energy at industrial scale constitutes a barrier that money alone cannot overcome quickly. The consequence has been a dramatic expansion of the green aluminum price premium. Where that premium once hovered between 5% and 10% above standard aluminum spot prices, recent contracts have seen it reach 50% or higher. That is not a premium in the traditional sense. That represents the emergence of an entirely separate market. This is the question that most coverage fails to even pose. Because the geopolitical context in which this price surge is unfolding is striking in its implications. The aluminum cost crisis is playing out against the backdrop of escalating trade tensions between the United States and Canada. The 51st state rhetoric may have been delivered in a joking register, but it rests atop years of accumulated friction over dairy tariffs, softwood lumber disputes, and a range of other bilateral trade irritants. Canada has historically occupied the role of the deferential, accommodating neighbor, the reliable partner, the conflict-averse ally. That reputation, while largely deserved, has obscured an important material reality. Canada controls critical resources, and in a world increasingly governed by carbon accounting, those resources carry substantially greater geopolitical weight than is commonly appreciated. Aluminum is formally classified as a strategic material. It is essential for defense manufacturing, automobile production, consumer electronics fabrication, and of course beverage packaging at industrial scale. Whoever controls the low-carbon supply of that material at the precise historical moment when carbon accounting is becoming mandatory rather than voluntary controls a supply chain choke point of genuine strategic significance. And Canada achieved this position without issuing a single policy statement, without making a single diplomatic threat. The leverage was built into the infrastructure decades before anyone recognized its geopolitical dimensions. There is a historical parallel that is imperfect but nonetheless illuminating. Consider China's dominance over rare earth metal processing. For an extended period, China methodically consolidated control over the extraction and processing of rare earth elements. Most governments and corporations paid little attention, because rare earth metals seemed like an obscure and peripheral industrial concern. Then, as those materials became indispensable for batteries, semiconductors, and renewable energy technologies, the world abruptly recognized that a single country exercised decisive control over a critical segment of the global supply chain. The leverage had been embedded quietly over years. No dramatic announcement was required. Canada's position in green aluminum has a structurally similar configuration. It is not as extreme in its concentration, and the geopolitical context differs in important respects. But the underlying logic is identical. Control over the clean production of a critical industrial material in a carbon-constrained world generates leverage whether or not that leverage is ever explicitly invoked. This is the bind that makes the situation particularly acute for the beverage giants. Abandoning Canadian aluminum sourcing in favor of alternative suppliers is not a commercially or reputationally viable option. If these companies shift to non-Canadian, higher-carbon aluminum, they violate their publicly announced and legally documented sustainability commitments. They expose themselves to carbon border taxes in European markets and, potentially, in U.S. markets as those policies develop. They open themselves to sustained activist shareholder pressure, consumer backlash, and reputational damage that their brand equity, built over generations, cannot absorb casually. The environmental pledges that Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and their peers announced were not offhand remarks. They were delivered to investors at earnings presentations. They were submitted to regulators in compliance disclosures. They were publicized to consumers as foundational commitments. Reversing them is not a minor public relations inconvenience. It represents a fundamental credibility crisis with cascading consequences across every dimension of the business. The option of simply going elsewhere does not exist in any practical sense, not for companies that intend to remain competitive in European markets and to maintain their standing with institutional investors who take ESG disclosures seriously. In principle, yes. In practice, the calculation is far more complicated than it might initially appear. The global beverage market is extraordinarily sensitive to price fluctuations. A nominal increase in the retail price of a can of Coca-Cola may sound inconsequential in isolation, but at the volumes these corporations depend upon for their financial performance, Even marginal per unit cost increases translate into meaningful aggregate impacts. And these companies are not operating in a competitive vacuum. Store brand alternatives, regional competitors, and any other producer that locked in aluminum supply contracts earlier or that operates under less stringent green sourcing requirements retains a structural pricing advantage. Consequently, Coca-Cola and Pepsi are currently absorbing a substantial portion of these elevated costs internally, which registers as margin compression in their quarterly earnings reports, generates increasingly pointed commentary in investor calls, and manifests in growing advocacy activity directed at trade associations and legislative bodies. What these companies are doing with considerable energy behind the scenes is lobbying aggressively for public investment in domestic green aluminum manufacturing capacity within the United States. And that advocacy is producing some results. The Biden administration allocated funding for clean energy manufacturing initiatives. Legislative proposals for new domestically operated renewable-powered smelters have been introduced and debated. But here is the fundamental temporal problem. Even if construction commenced tomorrow on new U.S.-based green aluminum facilities, the realistic timeline for those facilities to reach meaningful production scale is somewhere between 5 and 10 years. Canada retains control of the supply throughout that entire period. Companies are exploring alternatives, but every candidate carries its own set of significant trade-offs that make straightforward substitution implausible at scale. Glass is substantially heavier than aluminum, which dramatically increases transportation costs and carbon emissions associated with shipping. It is more expensive to produce at equivalent volumes. It breaks. Plastic carries its own severe environmental stigma and faces increasing legislative restriction across multiple major markets. Aluminum became the globally dominant packaging material for beverages for reasons that remain as valid today as they were when the industry made that choice. It is lightweight, highly recyclable, extraordinarily durable, and was historically inexpensive to produce and procure. Transitioning away from aluminum cans at the scale that Coca-Cola and PepsiCo operate would not be a straightforward operational pivot. It would constitute a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar restructuring of their entire supply chain and manufacturing apparatus, and even upon completion, it would exchange one set of difficult problems for a different set. Let us consider the plausible trajectories from the current situation, because there are essentially three distinct scenarios, each carrying its own implications for corporations, governments, and geopolitical relationships. Scenario 1. The quiet continuation. Canada continues to derive commercial benefit from its structural competitive advantage. Aluminum prices stabilize at this elevated plateau and become the new baseline that U.S. companies simply accept as the permanent cost of operating in a carbon-accountable world. Washington allocates funding for domestic green aluminum development, but those projects take the better part of a decade to produce meaningful output. In the interim, Canadian producers collect the green premium with comfortable consistency. This is the slow burn outcome, no dramatic confrontations, no headline-generating trade disputes, just a sustained and largely invisible transfer of economic value northward across the border. Scenario 2. The trade conflict escalation. The U.S. government concludes that Canada is exploiting what amounts to a resource monopoly and responds with tariff instruments, domestic production subsidies, or both. Political momentum builds to formally classify green aluminum as a strategic material subject to protective trade measures. Canada retaliates, perhaps by constraining export volumes, perhaps by structuring pricing arrangements that discriminate against U.S. buyers, perhaps by leveraging aluminum as an explicit bargaining chip in negotiations over the long-standing disputes around dairy products, softwood lumber, and other trade irritants. The confrontation escalates into a broader bilateral trade conflict. This is the disruptive outcome. It would impose real economic costs on both countries. It would introduce uncertainty and disruption across multiple industrial sectors. But it is far from difficult to envision if political pressure within the United States builds to a sufficient level. Scenario 3. The structural permanence of the green premium. Global carbon border adjustment mechanisms accelerate their implementation timeline and deepen their coverage. The price premium attached to green aluminum becomes not merely elevated but permanently and structurally embedded in the global pricing framework. Canada effectively becomes, in this scenario, the OPEC of the aluminum world, exercising over the supply of low-carbon metal a form of pricing influence analogous to what oil-producing nations exercised over energy markets throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Other nations invest in competing smelting capacity powered by renewable energy, but Canada's head start, combined with the natural hydroelectric advantages that Quebec and other provinces possess, sustains its dominant position across multiple decades. This is the long-game outcome, and it is arguably the scenario that should concern American policymakers most acutely, because it is not merely about aluminum. It is about what happens when climate policy systematically generates new resource dependencies that structurally replicate the dependencies that characterize the fossil fuel era. What this entire situation reveals, in ways that extend well beyond any particular company's quarterly earnings, is that climate policy is not merely an environmental agenda. It is actively constructing new economic architectures and geopolitical power relationships. And those structures are fundamentally reshaping the map of global leverage. For many years, the dominant assumption within Washington's policy apparatus was that the green energy transition would be a domain of American technological and financial leadership. U.S. capital, U.S. innovation, and U.S. institutional scale would drive and dominate the new low-carbon economy. In some sectors, that assumption retains validity. But in others, and green aluminum represents a particularly stark example, the infrastructural advantages were established decades ago by nations that were not thinking about carbon markets at all. Canada did not set out to weaponize its hydroelectric generating capacity. Quebec did not construct its network of massive dams with any strategic intent to dominate a future green commodity market. The dams and the smelters were built where they were built because that is where the cheap, abundant energy was. But today, that accumulated legacy infrastructure constitutes a source of leverage that Canada has never needed to announce, threaten, or formally activate. It simply exists, embedded quietly in the supply chains that global corporations depend upon. The reputation Canada carries internationally, as the polite, reliable, conflict-averse neighbor, is genuine, and it is largely earned. But that reputation has also functioned to obscure from casual observers the reality that Canada controls access to critical resources. And in a world where carbon accounting is transitioning from voluntary aspiration to regulatory mandate, those resources carry geopolitical weight that previous generations would not have attributed to them. The 51st state just lands very differently when you actually examine the directional flow of material dependencies. The United States requires Canadian aluminum. It requires Canadian energy. It requires Canadian minerals across multiple critical categories. Canada, obviously, requires access to the U.S. market, the largest consumer market on Earth. But these dependencies are not symmetric, and they are becoming progressively less symmetric as climate policy continues to tighten and as the premium attached to low-carbon production continues to compound. There is a broader and more universal lesson embedded in this story about the mechanics of geopolitical power transitions. The most consequential shifts in global influence do not always announce themselves through dramatic summit negotiations, military confrontations, or formal diplomatic declarations. Sometimes, and perhaps most often, they materialize in commodity price indices, in the quiet restructuring of supply chain dependencies, in the gradual reconfiguration of who manufactures what and who depends on whom. Aluminum, considered in isolation, seems like a mundane subject. It is a metal. It is cans. It is packaging. But the fact that Canada exercises dominant control over the clean production of that metal at the precise historical moment when clean has transitioned from a marketing attribute to a regulatory necessity is a shift in leverage with implications that will reverberate through trade policy, corporate strategy, and international relations for years and perhaps decades to come. Several specific developments merit close attention as this situation continues to evolve. First, watch U.S. government investment commitments to domestic green aluminum production. If Washington begins directing serious and sustained capital toward building renewable-powered smelting capacity at home, that constitutes a signal that policymakers have internalized the strategic dimensions of the situation. Second, monitor the content of U.S.-Canada bilateral trade negotiations. If aluminum begins appearing explicitly in those discussions, it indicates that Scenario 2, the trade conflict trajectory, is gaining momentum. Third, pay close attention to earnings calls and investor communications from Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and other major aluminum-dependent manufacturers. If cost pressures and supply chain constraints around green aluminum become recurring themes in those disclosures, it confirms that the pressure is structural and durable rather than temporary. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, track the development of carbon border adjustment mechanisms globally. Those policies constitute the enforcement infrastructure that converts green aluminum from a voluntary preference into an unavoidable operational imperative. Their pace of implementation and geographical spread will determine how rapidly and how fully the leverage embedded in Canada's position gets activated. The 50% aluminum price surge currently hitting Coca-Cola and Pepsi is not, at its core, a story about commodity fluctuations or beverage industry economics. It is an early and vivid preview of how the global transition to low-carbon production is fundamentally restructuring the distribution of economic and geopolitical power. It is a reminder, one that should register with policymakers, corporate strategists, and attentive citizens alike, that the nations which own and control the infrastructure for a low-carbon industrial future will exercise a form of leverage that closely mirrors the leverage that petroleum-exporting nations wielded for the better part of the 20th century. The geography of power is being redrawn. And it is being redrawn not in foreign ministries or military headquarters, but in commodity markets, supply chain contracts, and the quiet accounting of who produces what the world increasingly cannot do without.